Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You know that saying, power corrupts?
Oh, yeah. Definitely a familiar one.
Well, today we're diving into a study that supposedly proves that very idea,
Uh-huh.
the Stanford prison experiment. But here's the twist. What if everything you think you know about this experiment is wrong?
It's certainly become a cultural touchstone, hasn't it? This idea that even good people can turn bad, given the right, or I guess the wrong circumstances.
Right, exactly. And we're going to unpack all of that today with a ton of research expert analysis, even audio recordings from the experiment itself.
Should be fascinating. Buckle up, folks, because the truth might just be a lot stranger and a lot more unsettling than the story you've heard.
Definitely. So to really understand this whole thing, we need to set the stage. Go back with me to 1971.
Okay. Back in time we
It
go.
was a pretty intense time, right?
Ah.
The Vietnam War, protests, civil rights movement.
Yeah, a period of some major social and political upheaval. And that context is important because it was reflected in the world of academia, too.
How so?
Well, within psychology, a big debate was raging about what shapes our behavior more. Is it our inherent personality or the situations we find ourselves in? Nature versus nurture, essentially.
Right. And just a few years before the Stanford prison experiment, Stanley Milgram did those famous obedience experiments.
Oh, yeah, with the electric shocks.
Exactly, where participants were told to administer increasingly strong shocks to another person. And a surprisingly high number of them obeyed even when they thought they were causing serious harm.
Those results really shook things up, made people question just how far we'd go under orders.
So then comes Philip Zimbardo with the Stanford prison experiment. He wanted to go beyond Milgram, create a more immersive simulation of prison life, and see if putting quote-unquote normal people in that context would bring out their dark sides.
And Zimbardo was already a bit of a controversial figure himself before this even started.
How come?
Well, he had done this broken windows experiment where he parked a car in the Bronx and another one in Palo Alto, a low-income area versus a wealthy one.
And what happened?
The car in the Bronx was vandalized, while the one in Palo Alto was left untouched. And Zimbardo's conclusion was that the environment, those visible signs of crime and disorder, could actually influence criminal behavior.
Interesting. So he was already making some pretty bold claims about the power of situations.
Exactly. His work actually ended up influencing law enforcement strategies, but there were also criticisms that he was oversimplifying complex issues and ignoring things like socioeconomic factors.
Right. Makes sense. But we'll definitely circle back to that later because it ties into the whole Stanford prison experiment thing too. But first, let's talk about how this experiment was actually set up.
Picture this. They built a mock prison in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building, put out a newspaper ad calling for male college students to participate in a study of prison life.
Prison life. Sounds a bit ominous already.
Right, and they offered $15 a day, which back then was actually a pretty decent chunk of change.
So that ad itself might have already attracted a certain type of person, don't you think?
That's a really good point. And there was actually a later study that found people who responded to that kind of ad scored higher on measures of aggressiveness.
So not necessarily a random sample of normal college students then.
Exactly. And here's another wrinkle. Remember we mentioned Zimbardo was already a bit controversial?
Yeah, the breaking windows thing.
Well, it turns out a student of his had actually conducted a very similar experiment in his dorm just a few months before.
Or kidding. So the Stanford prison experiment was basically riffing off of his own students' work.
There are some really striking similarities. It raises questions about originality and Zimbardo's motivations, for sure. It wasn't widely known for years, and even when it came out, it was kind of brushed aside.
Wow. So we have a controversial figure running an experiment based on a maybe not so random sample of participants and potentially plagiarized ideas.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. They narrowed it down to 24 participants who they deemed the most psychologically stable and normal.
Flipped a coin to decide who would be guards and who would be prisoners.
And get this, to make things more realistic, the prisoners were actually arrested at their homes by real Palo Alto police officers.
Talk about method acting, right? Fingerprinting mugshots the whole 9 yards.
But here's a really important point that often gets overlooked. The guards weren't just left to their own devices. They were actually given very specific instructions during their orientation.
Yeah, they were told to maintain order, enforce the rules, and basically act like real prison guards. In fact,
Yeah.
there are audio recordings where you can hear one of Zimbardo's assistants coaching the guards, telling them to be tough and really emphasize their authority over the prisoners.
So they weren't just observing how behavior unfolded naturally, they were actively shaping the situation.
Exactly. And that directly contradicts Zimbardo's later claims that the guards' brutality was spontaneous, a natural outcome of the situation.
Interesting. What about the prisoners, though? How were they prepped for their roles?
Well, a big part of it was dehumanization. They were stripped, searched, given uniforms with no underwear, had to wear stocking caps over their heads. They were referred to by number, not name, and even had a chain locked around one ankle.
Wow. Talk about setting the scene for discomfort and powerlessness.
Right, and while Zimbardo always maintained that the prisoners were free to leave at any time, the reality was a bit more complicated.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, in the Ethics Committee application for the experiment, it explicitly stated that the prisoners would be led to believe they couldn't leave.
Wait, so they weren't actually free to leave?
It was more like they could request to be released for emergency reasons, which created a very different dynamic. It made the whole thing feel a lot more like actual imprisonment than a psychological study.
So not exactly a situation of free and informed consent, then.
And on top of that, the prisoners wouldn't receive their payment until the end of the experiment, which kind of created a financial incentive to stay, even if things got really bad.
It sounds like Zimbardo was really setting things up to get the results he wanted.
And remember, all of this was happening in a basement. Limited outside contact, constant camera surveillance, just amplifying the feeling of isolation and control.
Okay, so we've got our stage set, our actors in place, the cameras are rolling. What happens next? Well, you'll have to come back for part 2 to find out.
Welcome back. So last time we left off with our prisoners and guards settling into their new roles. Or I guess you could say being molded into those roles by the experiment itself.
Right, and it's important to remember just how isolated they were. No internet, no cell phones. They were stuck in that basement with nothing but each other and those cameras.
And even the cameras weren't capturing everything. They were only filming about 6 hours out of the entire experiment.
Really?
Yeah, and they focused on the most dramatic moments. So what we see in the footage and what Zimbardo presented to the world is a very carefully curated version of events. It wasn't exactly the objective scientific observation we were led to believe.
It's like watching a highlight reel of a basketball game. You see the slam dunks and the amazing plays, but you miss all the fouls and the struggles.
A perfect analogy. So with that in mind, let's see what went down in this prison.
Okay, bring on the drama.
Well, things escalated pretty quickly. On the second day, the prisoners, feeling increasingly dehumanized and frustrated, they decided to rebel.
What did they do?
They barricaded themselves in their cells, ripped off their numbers, and started taunting the guards.
Oh. Sounds like this controlled experiment was starting to lose control.
Yeah, you could say that. The guards, feeling their authority challenged, they responded with force.
What did that look like? I mean, it was a simulation, right?
Well, remember, the guards had been told to be tough and maintain order, and they really took that to heart. They started using psychological tactics to break the prisoners down.
Like what?
They stripped them naked, took away their beds, even sprayed fire extinguishers into their cells to force them out.
Fire extinguishers, seriously?
Yep. And that was just the beginning. They set up this privileged cell where prisoners would get better treatment, special food, even the luxury of brushing their teeth.
Sounds nice.
It was. But access to that cell was totally arbitrary based on the guards' whims, which just created paranoia and distrust among the prisoners.
Classic divide and conquer.
Exactly. It worked like a charm. The prisoners became suspicious of each other, worried about being labeled a snitch if they complained, and the punishments, they just kept escalating.
How so?
The guards made some prisoners clean toilets with their bare hands, denied them bathroom breaks, even forced them to urinate and defecate in buckets, which were then left in their cells.
That's awful. And Zimbardo and his team just let this happen.
Let's not forget, Zimbardo wasn't just some detached observer. He was actively involved, playing the role of the prison superintendent. Some would argue he was actually encouraging the guards' behavior.
So how did the prisoners handle this abuse?
Some of them broke down. Prisoner #8612. Just 3 days in, he started experiencing acute emotional distress, crying uncontrollably, screaming, demanding to be released.
Oh, wow.
Zimbardo initially tried to convince him to stay, but eventually he had to let him go.
So it wasn't all just acting and playing along. These were real people having real emotional responses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Zimbardo really downplayed these departures from the experiment. He focused on the prisoners who stayed, the ones who seemed to adapt to their roles and internalize their powerlessness.
To make it seem like his theory was working.
Right. He even had visitors come in, family and friends of the participants, to observe this prison.
Seriously, they brought in outsiders.
Yep. It's hard to say for sure how that affected the dynamic, but it certainly adds another layer of complexity. Zimbardo claimed that even the visitors adopted the roles of concerned family members talking to the warden about their worries. But again, there's no real evidence to support that.
Just more manipulation of the narrative.
And then things get even weirder. On the fifth day, they brought in a Catholic priest to talk to the prisoners.
But priest, why?
Zimbardo, in his later write-ups, claimed that even the priest unconsciously adopted the role of a prison chaplain. Like, there's a specific way a priest should act in a prison. It just feels like one more detail that adds to the theatricality of the experiment more than its scientific validity.
So this whole thing is starting to feel less like a scientific experiment and more like a carefully staged performance.
Right. But even amidst all this manufactured drama, there were moments of genuine resistance from the prisoners. One prisoner went on a hunger strike to protest the conditions. Another developed a severe rash because the guards had taken away his eczema medication.
So they weren't all just passive victims.
And then there's Doug Corpy, the prisoner, who seemed to have a complete mental breakdown on camera.
I remember seeing that footage. It was pretty intense.
It was. But Corpy later claimed that he was faking it.
Wait, really?
Yeah. He said he had a background in theater and just wanted out of the experiment. Zimbardo has disputed this, of course, saying Corpy changed his story multiple times and even appeared on Dr. Phil, with Zimbardo presenting his breakdown as genuine.
So even the prisoners' responses are open to interpretation, wrapped up in layers of performance and potential manipulation.
It's a mess, honestly. A tangled web of conflicting accounts, shifting narratives, and questionable motivations. But one thing is clear, this experiment was far from the straightforward demonstration of situational evil that Zimbardo initially claimed it to be.
So if it wasn't really about proving that good people turn bad in bad situations, then why did Zimbardo stop the experiment after just 6 days?
The official story is that his girlfriend at the time, Christina Maslach, a psychology grad student, visited the prison and was horrified by what she saw.
She convinced him to shut it down.
Well, that's the romantic version. But research by Thibault Letexier, who did an extensive analysis of the archives, suggests there were other factors at play. Zimbardo was exhausted, hadn't slept in days, and already had enough footage and data to support his conclusions.
So even the ending of the experiment is shrouded in uncertainty.
And that uncertainty extends to the experiment's legacy. Zimbardo has spent decades defending his work, but as more information has come to light, he's kind of shifted his stance. He now refers to it as a demonstration rather than an experiment.
A demonstration of what exactly?
With his own biases, perhaps. He went into this study with a predetermined narrative, manipulated the situation to fit that narrative, and then presented his findings as universal truths about human nature.
It's starting to feel less like a deep dive and more like a deep deception.
You got that right.
Okay.
But before we completely dismiss the Stanford prison experiment, we do need to talk about its impact and the critiques it's faced.
Yeah, what can we actually learn from its flaws?
We'll tackle all of that in part 3, where we'll explore the lasting influence of this very controversial study and look at some alternative perspectives on how personality, situation, and behavior all interact in the real world.
Welcome back to the show. So we've spent the last 2 parts really digging into this Stanford prison experiment, uncovering all the layers of this, captivating but ultimately really flawed study.
Yeah, we've seen how Zimbardo's own biases, the problems with his methods, and honestly, some pretty manipulative tactics really shaped the outcome and, skewed the findings.
But even with all of those problems, the Stanford prison experiment has had this huge impact on our culture. It's become like the go-to explanation for everything from police brutality to bad bosses.
Right. It's that cautionary tale,
Yeah.
that we're all just susceptible to the corrupting influence of power, and even good people can turn bad given the wrong situation.
So how did a study with so many issues gain so much influence?
It's a few things, really. Timing definitely played a role. Remember, this was 1971, the Vietnam War prison riots, the Watergate scandal. People were looking for answers, trying to understand, how these horrible things could happen.
And the Stanford prison experiment offered this simple, compelling explanation. It wasn't about some inherent evil. It was all about the situation. Stick good people in a bad environment and boom, instant monsters.
It was a message that really tapped into the anxieties of the time.
And Zimbardo was a master storyteller.
Yeah.
Using those vivid images and dramatic anecdotes to make his findings stick.
Oh, yeah, he knew how to work a crowd. Presented his work at conferences, wrote articles for popular magazines, even went on talk shows. He made it seem groundbreaking and relatable.
But hold on a second. There is some truth to the idea that situations can influence behavior.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I mean, we all act differently depending on where we are and who we're with.
Absolutely. But the Stanford prison experiment doesn't actually prove that in a scientifically sound way. It
Hmm.
was more like a theatrical production than a controlled experiment with Zimbardo directing the whole thing.
Right, right. And what about that Australian study that tried to replicate the Stanford prison experiment? Didn't they find some different results?
Yeah, that study is so important because it shows the problems with Zimbardo's conclusions. They ran the experiment 3 times with slightly different conditions each time.
Yeah.
In one condition, they created a very authoritarian environment, kind of like Zimbardo's setup, and they got similar results. The guards became more assertive, the prisoners more submissive.
So that supports Zimbardo's theory.
Right. But in the other conditions, they let the guards and prisoners interact more and make decisions together. And guess what?
What?
No abuse, no breakdowns, no descent into tyranny.
So the situation isn't destiny. We still have choices.
Exactly. And focusing only on the situation ignores all these other factors, individual differences, cultural norms, societal structures. Those all play a role too.
It's like saying that everyone who grows up in poverty will become a criminal,
Mm.
which is just not true.
And we can't forget the ethical side of things either. The psychological harm that was done to those students, the manipulation, the lack of real consent. It raises serious concerns about how far research should go.
Yeah, I mean, even Holocaust scholars have criticized Zimbardo for using his experiment to explain the Holocaust.
They say it's way too simplistic. You can't just reduce this complex historical event to situational pressures.
Right. There were so many other factors involved.
And Zimbardo's use of that banality of evil concept from Hannah Arendt's work has also been challenged.
Remind me what that was again?
So Arendt was writing about Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi war criminal. She argued that he wasn't this monstrous fanatic, but more like an ordinary bureaucrat who carried out his duties with terrifying efficiency.
And Zimbardo took that to mean that evil is banal. Anyone can be capable of horrible acts given the right circumstances.
But Arndt's point was much more nuanced. She was talking about the danger of blindly obeying authority, the failure to think critically and make moral judgments.
It's a really important distinction.
It is. So the takeaway from all of this isn't that we're all potential monsters just waiting for the right moment to snap. It's that we need to be wary of those simple explanations, those studies that just confirm what we already believe.
We need to be critical thinkers, question our assumptions, look for biases, consider different perspectives.
Exactly. The Stanford prison experiment might be flawed and ethically problematic, but it can still serve as a cautionary tale. Not about the evil of humanity, but about the dangers of unchecked authority, how situations can influence us, and the importance of personal responsibility.
It's a good reminder that we're all capable of good and bad, and that the choices we make, even under pressure, those really matter.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener? When you come across information, especially about human behavior, be skeptical. Ask questions. Look for those hidden biases, the missing context. Don't just accept things at face value, especially when it comes to easy answers about who we are and why we do what we do.
There's always more to the story, and that's the beauty of a deep dive like this. It challenges us to think critically, and often leaves us with more questions than answers.
And sometimes those unanswered questions are the most important ones.
Well said. On that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the Stanford prison experiment. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.